We're coming to our next guest. It's Kent Redford. He was born in Taiwan and traveled and lived in the Far East and Middle East. And he devoted his career to conservation strategies and biology. He received his PhD from Harvard, and he was a postdoc fellow and academic staff at the University of Florida. And he worked in the Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation. He focused his research on the role of science in conservation practicing, evaluating conservation effectiveness and the intersection between synthetic biology and conservation. After academia, he joined the Nature Conservancy in 1993, and he worked for them a couple of years and developed guidelines for eco-region-based conservation. Later on, he joined the Wildlife Conservation Society to work in international programs on conservation strategies. And in 2011, he founded his own consulting company, which is advising and helping individuals and organizations to improve their practices in conservation. And he will talk about the role of synthetic biology in conserving the new nature today. So the floor is yours.
My life was actually more exciting than it sounds from that. So good morning. Thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I hope, as with Phil, that the talks we're giving are going to be setting a broader context within which we can then have the more extensive discussion about the coral issue. I look forward to that. So, whether you call what we're living in now the Anthropocene or new nature, humankind has, and I stress without forethought, created a new relationship with the natural world. Here you have a person cleaning the blue whale in the American Museum of Natural History. When I entered this field, we believed that nature should be conserved free from human influence, and instead of which, in the course of my own professional life, we have learned that the presence and impact of humans is ubiquitous, from the ocean realm to the terrestrial realm. And that in fact, we live in a world in which nature and humans are inextricably linked. In fact, it's a hybrid world. And that what we need is a new set of conservation practices that, unlike the ones I was raised with, are really hybrid. I want to talk about a few of those things that are already in play. But this is a reflection of the extent to which humans have been altering nature for its own purposes. So Japanese have small refrigerators, and we're not buying watermelons because they did not efficiently fit in this Japanese refrigerators. So the answer is to then make watermelons the right shape to fit in the refrigerators, and the market increased dramatically. Lyrebirds, which are superb mimics, have a very rich vocal repertoire, have added the sound of chainsaws to the songs that they sing to each other. Depressing, but effective. In certain settings, you find hermit crabs who do not have sufficient shells and are therefore using cast up plastic lids in order to live their hermit crab lives. And in what perhaps for me is the most distressing of these examples, there is now an app that you can buy for your phone called Scrite that allows you to write on the sky, so that people who then have the app and point their phone at the portion of the sky on which you have written will be able to see, as this image illustrates, what you have written on the sky. We have left nothing to not be despoiled by human nature, especially like what a view over the bridge. Wow, that's a great addition. So the extent to which nature has become used to this extensive human impact is illustrated in this case from the US Endangered Species Act. A 2012 study showed that 82% of the taxa listed by the US Endangered Species Act would require perpetual human management in order to survive. That very notion in which we would keep humans from nature and nature would take care of herself is not the case, at least in that setting. And of course, overwhelming this whole thing is climate change and the kinds of changes that it has caused. So here is an ironic photograph of the New York Aquarium where the salt water is actually outside the saltwater tank holding the fish. So I was raised and trained graduate students based on this sort of simple dichotomy that people are bad, they ruin the world, and that nature is good, and if we kept one from the other, everything would be fine. In fact, we find that we are needing a set of these hybrid conservation approaches to address this. So from the Netherlands and from Europe, you have rising use of practices of rewilding and de-domestication. In this case, in the Netherlands, you actually have the release of horses into wildland areas. They receive no veterinary or supplemental feeding, and they then are an attempt to reach back into their past. Tarpan, which went extinct in the Pleistocene, would be replicated by these de-domesticated horses. Or in this example, which I find particularly ironic, South China tigers are a subspecies of tigers, and there are no South China tigers left in South China. As you can imagine, it's all full of South Chinese. However, they're well represented in the zoo, and in a fit of amazing optimism, there is an organization which would like to prepare South China tigers to be able to be released into South China and to feed on hopefully natural prey and not South Chinese. But in order to train excuse the slip of the tongue, in order to train captive raised tigers to kill wild prey, they have purchased land in South Africa and have released tigers into South African land and trained them to hunt on South African antelope. And because we want to represent Oceania, of course, here is an effort to move rhinos out of Africa into Australia as a means of saving them. So this kind of approach, those are species examples, and there is the equivalent within the ecosystem component of biodiversity, which is a whole emerging field to which Phil made reference of, about novel ecosystems. And you have the same dichotomy that Phil illustrated, with some people desperately arguing against these species and ecological processes in combinations not previously seen on the Earth, and others who are saying, get over it. This is what the future looks like, and conservation needs to embrace these sorts of novel combinations and accept that that's the new world we live in. Madeline, who I hadn't met before I read her paper, it was a great pleasure to meet her on a couple of occasions, I think has taken a major and controversial step, as will be discussed the rest of the day, in terms of actually taking a more conscious, purposeful hand instead of the accidental ones we're currently employing, and actually attempting to direct evolution for the purposes of the conservation of nature, whatever that means at that point. And that extends not only to the manipulation of genes and microbiomes, but also to, these are 3D printed reefs, which have been used as the basis for trying to restore reefs under which the larvae of coral reef organisms hopefully will settle. So in fact, I make this point, I would argue, and I don't think you would find this a difficult argument to accept, that we have become commingled, we as the species Homo sapien, with the rest of the natural world, making it hard to know exactly what conservation is about anymore. And I want to stress with these two pictures that this is not a new issue. So these are the Marmara Falls, the water from the Velino River in the hills in Italy, regarded as one of the most beautiful waterfalls in Italy. They were constructed by the Romans in 271 BC in order to drain a swampy area. So this manipulation of the natural world in order to achieve human ends has a deep history, and like much of our history in the Western world, blame the Romans. So the current ways of thinking about the types of conservation, there's an argument for those of you who like to assist in the fights that break out occasionally in the conservation world, in which conservation should be directed at biocentric things. It's really all about intrinsic nature. Or those who say, aha, you're wrong, it really should be about human ends, the anthropocentric nature, and you have yes it is, no it isn't, shoving back and forth. And that's always a great place to publish papers. So if any of you young people enter this fray, and you can pick a side and get a paper published. However, the argument I want to make is that is an insufficient way of looking at the range of possibilities that we must consider in the future of conservation. That in fact, there has opened up a novel operating space for conservation. And it is into this novel operating space that you drive the questions that I want to spend the rest of the time discussing, which is how do we think about synthetic biology as a pursuit when thinking about the conservation of the natural world. For those of you who are not facile with the notion of synthetic biology, a few slides. Those people in synthetic biology can't even agree on a definition of their own field, so there are a variety of different ones. This is a useful one. The application of science, technology, and engineering to facilitate and accelerate the design, manufacture, and or modifications of genetic materials in living organisms. In other words, as my colleague Rob Carlson wrote in a book which is a little dated now, but remains, I think, the best one to read, Biology is Technology. The engineers have discovered biology and are threatening to take it over. The speed at which these changes are taking place, I will argue, as others have, is extraordinary. So for those of you who are familiar with Moore's Law, it was developed by Gordon Moore, one of the founders of Intel, and it has to do with the rate at which transistors are miniaturized. And so, you know, the famous comparison that the computing power you have in your pocket, in your cell phone, is greater than that which occurred in the moon landing craft that was sent up by NASA. So that is represented in the dark blue line, the rate at which change took place, Moore's Law. If you look at red and yellow, you see the rate of change in which the reading and writing of DNA have taken place. The point of this slide is that the slopes are steeper than they were for Moore's Law. If these are the rate limiting, the technological rate limiting factors in the development of synthetic biology, we can anticipate a speed of change that is greater than that which we have seen in the computing power and what that has enabled us to do. An extraordinary thing to consider as we continue this discussion. So these changes are then, these technology changes are being drawn into and driven by a set of, particularly in agriculture and in human medicine. So there is an effort to change the type of photosynthesis that occurs in rice from a less efficient C3 photosynthesis to a more efficient C4. Think about it. The most basic chemical reactions in a plant which bring about life on which all of the rest of us depend, we're proposing to change that. And if they succeed, these are the predictions. Of course, optimistic, but the predictions are 50% greater yield in rice, half the water, much less fertilizer, and perhaps a greater resistance to climate change by changing the most fundamental part of one of the most, or the most important food plants on Earth. This is another example. This business just opened last month. You can now order leather in the color you want, in the flexibility or stiffness you want, and you can get it produced in sheets. It is perfect leather. It is chemically exactly the same as leather, and it never came from a cow. It came from vats of yeast, which have had their genomes engineered to produce the collagens, which are then binding and making the leather. Never seen a cow. Opiates, this report just came out recently in Nature. This lab in California has produced opiates from microbes by combining, look at the genes that they combined: Iranian poppies, opium poppies, California poppies, gold thread, rats, and a bacteria. So I'm going to say, well, a little bit of this, it's like breakfast at the Intercity Hotel. I'm going to have some of this and some of that, and then I'm going to put them all together and make it work. And then I can now produce opiates out of yeast cells. And then last week, these news came out, and this is really the most extraordinary thing. So you all remember from biology that there are four different components that are used to make up DNA. You know, A, C, T, and G. So all life uses those four until last week. There are two brand new codons that were inserted into a cell that is now self-reproducing. which have been instructed to make kinds of protein that have never been produced by a living cell in the entire history of the world. That was done by scientists in a lab, breaking a chain of evolution that has been there since life began on this earth. That's the fundamental nature of the kinds of changes that we're looking at. And it's happening everywhere, and it's happening, I want to make these points in the next few slides, by everybody. So do-it-yourself labs, these are labs run by communities, not trained scientists. You pay a fee, you walk in off the street, you have access to nearly the highest level equipment, and people are experimenting with novel life forms. See what happens when you mess with novel life forms. I don't know. So, and if you think you're young, these experiments are being done in global competitions through this iGEM competition. So in 2016, almost 300 teams, 42 countries, and high school teams. So you have 15 and 16-year-olds competing to make forms of life that have never been seen on the earth before. And look, they're laughing and smiling. You better worry about the future about that. So the New York Times, which we receive on Sundays, produced its first section for children 3 weeks ago. There's the first section. Now, this is for children. In the inside, you're laughing. This is for children. And look, oh, damn, I missed that. So this is for children, and in the interior section of it, it talks about time to get out your scissors and change life. All of this is going on, I want to remark, with very little consideration for how these technologies are going to impinge the natural world. So I've been involved in a set of meetings over the last number of years to try to bring together these conversations, and people like Madeline were at the last one, which was held in September, to try and bridge this gap and to start having conversations about the larger implications of these. Now, some of the context within which these technologies are being discussed for conservation include something that Phil is an expert in, which is actually attempting to revive extinct species, in this case the passenger pigeon, which was once the most common bird probably in the world and was driven extinct by commercial hunting. Then over to the right are the American chestnut trees. You can see the scale from the person that is there. Those trees are now extinct within the northeastern US, driven so in the early 1900s by Chinese chestnut plague. And importing a gene from wheat, they have now made American chestnuts immune to this and with the potential to restore that. Not only at a species level, but at a genetic level. So there are currently efforts ongoing. This is a black-footed ferret, which is extremely rare mustelid that lives only in prairie dog burrows. There's an attempt to use banked cells from museum and zoo collections to identify genetic variation that is lost in the living population and reintroduce that into the species. Then this is the Hawaiian Avian malaria example that has already been covered by Phil. Attempts to try and create a mosquito that can't carry the malaria to able to restore these honey creepers. And directly within the ongoing subject of our session today, there have been conversations about actually trying to turn on the genes of certain populations of corals that already manifest in certain populations a resistance to warmer water to enable the corals to respond to a warming ocean. There are a set of more uncertain but higher value potential applications. This is a map that is, I think, particularly overreaches, but the point is that there are degraded lands all around the world, some of which the estimates range from 6% to 13% of the Earth's terrestrial surface, which are no longer available for primary productivity, but could be restored potentially through the application of these technologies. We have a very difficult issue of controlling invasive species. There's an effort that is in process of trying to work out the biology on these things. It's using a gene drive. So these are house mice which are well studied in the lab, and also a major source of predation on seabirds on oceanic islands where they were introduced by people. This is using a naturally occurring gene drive in house mice to actually drive the sex chromosome so that you produce only males. So if this succeeds in the lab, and if permission is received to actually release these animals, you have the potential to eliminate island populations of house mice without ever killing a single individual. And foreshadowed is the opportunity to consider, as the coral biologist amongst you, I've already been extensively pursuing, but we terrestrial folks are behind you as usual, the idea of actually transforming a microbiome instead of working on the genome of the host species. So that's all biology stuff. And as Phil made clear from one of his slides, much of this is left outside the notion of people being very scared and against these technologies or the regulatory framework, etc. So some of the things that we must consider as we move forward with this include a set of issues that are particularly sort of cogent in my world. And one of those is that nature services will be, not can be, but will be synthesized. So we have placed a lot of our bets in the conservation world now on payment for ecosystem services, in which we explain the reason for society needing to save the natural world as that is a source of services that we need to survive. And if I can go in and synthesize those services without the need of the natural world, I put at great risk those things which I told you we should leave alone because you needed them, and now you don't need them. And you go, fine, I'll cut them down. So these are examples of poplar trees that have been engineered to double the rate of carbon sequestration. So already you see how you might be able to make it problematic, for example, for the saving of tropical forests. And then the one that is kind of biggest sitting out there is the fact that we have no idea what would happen when these synthesized genes, these synthesized genomes, hit natural selection. We just don't know. And there are those who are optimistic about the results, and there are those who are deeply pessimistic about all of these things being rearranged in completely unknown and dangerous ways by natural selection. Also, almost all of these technologies that have been deployed, particularly on the commercial side, rely on containment. That is, they have multiple layers to prevent those modified organisms that we're using to produce opioids or whatever from actually being released into the wild. And yet, if we want to use them for things like white nose syndrome, a horrible fungal scourge of colony bats in North America, they must not only not be contained, they must be engineered to self-disperse. That could be a huge problem. And deep concerns about privatization in nature. So if I patent the genetic changes that I'm inserting into black-footed ferrets, what does it mean? Does it mean that I have the rights to those endangered species because they contain genes that I have patented? This is driven by this mania, particularly from my country, the US, for everything to be owned. And Monsanto, the seed company which started all of this, has really done a great disservice. Now, then concerns about water use and land use impact. So these things here in the middle are algal raceways. That's a term of art for the devices that are used to grow algae commercially. So these are blue-green algae being raised on the coast of Hawaii for human nutritional supplements. But you can imagine if those algae were engineered to produce anything else, you might need to use this same kind of technology, which is very intensive of energy, of land, and of water. In the background is an image of oil palm plantations. So yeast have been engineered to produce palm oil that is of higher quality chemically than that which occurs from oil palms. Nobody has been able to scale that up to produce that commercially. But if you could, and it will produce through algae, might you simply swap out the plantations, which are eliminating the rainforest in Indonesia, for algal raceways? Is this what would really happen? In which case it might be an even worse outcome. We don't know when, and it's difficult to get people to engage in trying to imagine how this might work out. And the oceans, which are the focus here, we've got no idea. And I don't even know people who are writing, at least publishing that I see, who are speculating on the ways in which these technologies, if they were to reach the marine world, what would happen. And there are a set of people who are very concerned about rural livelihoods, and there's a community which is extremely active in the international spheres of discussing policy and legislation, who are deeply against all of this based on what they feel will be the implications for rural livelihoods, be it marine fishers or terrestrial agricultural. Now, there are companies that are already starting and are doing some very interesting things. I want to just talk about a couple of them. This is one which is taking methane that is normally flared off or burned and running it through water, through tanks in which modified yeast and bacteria are eating the methane, converting it into proteins and sugars, which are then harvested and pelletized and are sold as fish aquaculture. So you're preventing methane from entering the atmosphere, and you're reducing the impact on wild fisheries, and you're hopefully increasing the ability to raise aquaculture-raised fish. Also, impact on the marine world as the harvesting of Arctic krill and other things like menhaden off the coast of the northeastern US specifically for omega-3 fatty acids as nutritional supplements. Now, you can harvest canola, which is rapeseed, this plant here, and it has been modified to produce nutritionally significant levels of omega-3 fatty acids without ever needing a marine harvest in order to do this. So amazing, these kinds of things. Amazing, I think, the depth and breadth in which this wave is going to be sweeping over top of us. So where does that leave us? Certainly people like me and many of you in the audience with an interest in conservation. Do you have this extinction looms over native bird species? Or do you have the reckless striving? This is from one of the groups that's vehemently against this. Gene drives and the end of nature. So this is a table many of you will have seen, which is charts the worsening condition of the natural world. It doesn't matter what they are. All you need to do is see that each one of these threats to the natural world is going up and going up dramatically. You're familiar with that. I want to argue to you that we seem to be unable to imagine the kinds of disruption that these technologies are going to bring to our world. Say in agriculture. Two more examples for you. Sugarcane has been converted to a cold-tolerant crop. It no longer needs to be grown in the tropics. Soon it's going to be grown in who knows, in Germany. Down below, available in the market already is milk which never saw a cow. It is exactly the same thing as milk, but it is produced through genetically modified organisms. Disruptions in human medicine. This is a young girl whose life was saved by gene editing T cells and saving her from leukemia. It is photographs like this that are going to change the acceptance of these technologies. And potentially in conservation. So I don't know if folks in the audience are familiar with DARPA, which is the Defense Applied Research Agency in the United States. And they have opened a research competition, here, read this, to develop technologies that enable the genetic engineering of an organism's preference for a niche. So all the coral biologists are wondering whether they can apply for a DARPA grant. To control and alter the niche preferences of organisms to reduce economic, health, and resource burdens. The beginning lectures in ecology are about the nature of niche parameters as defining for the entities, the species to be concerned. We now are going to set about changing those. So when I entered, so I got my PhD before conservation biology had been officially invented. It got invented as a crisis discipline. This is what results from that mentality. Two of the most depressing books you can ever imagine in your life. 100 animals to see before they die and 500 places to see before they disappear, right? It's not that you should go there because it's beautiful and you want to save it. It's there, you want to go there, you want to see those animals because they're going to disappear and you want to be the last one so you can go home and say, you'll never get to go there because they're now extinct. Travel books. What kind of a way of viewing the future of the world is that? This is a license plate that was on a truck that was parked across from our house when we moved in Portland, Maine. Now, it was a truck that belonged to a fisher, but it might as well have belonged to a conservation biologist. Get up every morning, have your coffee, go outside, no hope. Go into the office, no hope. Go home, no hope. That's the field in which we have grown ourselves. We must reframe the way that we're talking to ourselves and to the conservation community and to the publics in the world. And part of that reframing needs to be to engage across the full range of things that are affecting us and not hide behind minimum population sizes and publications in ecology and modeling efforts. If we do that, and our resistance to do that is driven by the fact that it is forcing us to face a set of things that are very difficult to think about, that include conflicting objectives, conflicting values, important part of this, the datedness of many of our approaches. I can't tell you how hard it has been for me to try to remember my graduate school genetics in order to have any idea what these folks are talking about, and particularly the unknowns of the future, the fact that modeling is not going to work for many of these things. My argument to you is that we must own the imperative to shape this disruption curve that is going to sweep over us. We need to embrace the hybrid and we need to ride this risk to try and keep portions of the natural world with us. We have a thing against hybrids. All the time in our world, we want there to be men or women. We want there to be Republicans or Democrats. We don't want there to be gay people, by the way, because that's a kind of hybrid. Yet, despite the fact that disliking hybrids is an intrinsic part of our culture, it has been part of our evolution. This is a 40,000-year-old statue that is a hybrid. This is a 3,000-year-old statue that is a hybrid. This, on the left, is an Egyptian hybrid, and on the right, if any of you read those sorts of novels, it's a hybrid. On the left, from the 1300s, illustrations of monsters, and on the right, any year now, I don't know if Germany has this culture of furries. Does anybody know? Anybody know what a furry is? These are humans that believe they should have been born as animals. And so they have conventions and they meet once a year, dressed up as the animal they think they should have been born as. And then they're supposed to make look at you guys. You see this disquiet here? This is the disquiet about hybrids that is both intrinsic to us as humans and also a distaste that we have. Like, you guys are going to go out and look up furries, I know. I guarantee one person in this room is going to be going to a furry convention dressed what? As a coral reef. And it may be Madeline too, for that matter. And we're still doing it. So this is Coney Island, before I left New York. Looka, looka, looka. Come in and see the freaks. It should make you very uncomfortable. Yet this is the hybrid nature that we're living in. This is a black bear eating plants from a home garden in the central portion of the US. This is Belphegor, who was one of the 7 princes of hell. His particular skill was to help people make discoveries and to seduce people by suggesting ingenious inventions that will make them rich. We have had this attraction to technology at the same time we have recognized the danger that it poses to us ever since the first people decided who would be the princes of hell. And we have had this very strange response to technology. So this is from the Victorian News. And there was a belief when trains were first introduced that if you rode a train, it would drive you mad. So this is a drawing of a man who stabbed his best friend when they went for a train ride. because the sounds and the motions of train travel drove you crazy. You don't find this as a concern of traveling on trains anymore. So there is an entry cost to new technologies that we must understand is an essential part of the way humans respond to this. Now, when I give these talks, as I've given over the last several years, there are two frames that are most frequently used when people talk to me. The first is, my God, man, haven't you seen Jurassic Park? Or, didn't you read Frankenstein? So first place, Frankenstein wasn't the monster, he was the doctor. So when people ask this, they have never read the novel, or else they're glossing on it. The point I want to make here is these are works of fiction. So we are proposing to look at a technology which is very real in the real world with real world implications. The way that people respond out of deep concern comes from works of fiction. We have to understand the importance of storytelling as a way of thinking about the future options available to us, and not dismiss this as I have just done, but actually try and create a way of telling stories that at least can balance the negativity that exists in most people. So I end with this thing, which I really like. Their technologists say that the future is already here. It is just unevenly distributed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your talk. But a question that you mentioned a lot.
Frankenstein or Jurassic Park? Take your pick.
Thanks for the nice talk. I just want to question that, do you think it's possible to use synthetic biology to deal with multiple stresses and not just one single stressor of like global warming thing?
So if it's genetically based, if the response of the organism is genetically based, in theory, as long as you don't have conflicting attributes, you should, in theory, you ought to be able to change that. It's certainly been done in agriculture.
You're talking about hybridization, but actually, sometimes that hybridization in corals happens naturally, it happens all the time because they mass form and they broadcast all their eggs into the water. The potential of hybridization is already there. So I'm wondering, kind of using that to convince people that actually when we're doing these sorts of manipulative things, that we're actually doing things that are occurring in nature anyway, and perhaps using these ocean examples might be easier to convince people of the potential of these things to save corals and use in other systems.
Yeah, so I don't think it would work, simply because my understanding, and there's an interesting literature in the anthropological world about aversions to hybridness. It's apparently a deep cultural attribute, at least of a number of cultures in the Western world. I don't know about elsewhere. And my experience has been that using examples from the natural world to try to explain why what is going to be happening here should be of less concern fall flat completely. Because as we were discussing in this room yesterday, many of us were raised in a tradition where we thought evidence spoke for itself. So you lay this argument out and I say, aha, well, but corals do this and that. And your response is, I don't care. You don't understand. This isn't going to work. And what I've learned out of reading the conservation psychology work is that people frequently have already developed an opinion about something. And they are selectively reading and receiving material that allows them to reinforce their own existing opinion or to reinforce their bond with a group they feel has an opinion about the topic. And so the chances are that as you use that argument, you're actually talking to somebody who already sort of feels one way or another and will either reject it if it contradicts them or accept it if they already believe it. That's the world that we've entered in. So I just have this small sidelight to tell you. So the IUCN has to develop an opinion, a global opinion about the relationship between synthetic biology and conservation, particularly related to gene drives. And I've been asked to lead this process, and it's going to be very difficult because we're going to enter into this system in which the most vocal people are very set against it, period. But I think it'd be great. I would love to see one of you, all of you, publish something that makes that argument, because it could then be drawn in and used.
You know, thinking about the coral reef crisis, do you think that all these hurdles we have to overcome, you know, the research and development, we don't even have the tools yet for synthetic biology or assisted evolution, you know, it's really proof of concept stages. And then we have to convince the world that we were allowed to actually use these methods in the field. Do you think that this will happen on time? I mean, gene drives, as far as I understand, have not been released into the natural world at all, not even in other systems. So we're so far from even testing it. I mean, I understand gene drives are imperfect, which actually is good if you want to use it in terms of conservation. Like, you're not gonna, it's unlikely you will drive a species to extinction. It's well just to test another gene drive. So what's your opinion? I know we shouldn't give up all, we should try, but it's such an urgent issue that
so my bet would be on the first release of gene drives will be associated with malaria mosquitoes in sub-Saharan Africa, because there's a lot of money and there's a lot of effort. And what they have done, what they did almost from the beginning, was to engage in very broad scale consultation with interested publics about that. And that, I realize the last thing you need is more work to do, but if I were in your position, I would be finding people with the skills already to begin the societal conversations about coral reef and assisted evolution. Long before, as you're still working in the lab, and having those really go on around the world, particularly in places with coral reefs. Because I think that the biologist and the technologist position has long been, I'm going to develop it and get all ready, and then I'm going to ask society what you think about it. At that stage, the appropriate complaint from society is, you already know what you want to do, you're just trying to convince me to let you do it, as opposed to, I want your opinion about how this ought to go.
I agree with that, and we were having a discussion yesterday during lunch actually, that we are actually sort of trying to get this discussion in public and with regulatory bodies and so on. And just one word can sort of get misinterpreted in the media, and all of a sudden the message is out there, oh, your coral reefs actually can recover naturally. We don't need any of this intervention. One paper comes out last week about post-biology, and sort of gets a bit sort of misinterpreted in sort of conversation in this instance. And it's actually really difficult. Sort of we can't win. Yeah, we cannot. You know, if you say coral reefs are doomed, then the public will say, oh, we don't have to invest any resources into research in stable coral reefs. If you say there's a little bit, you know, how do you deal with that? It's such a difficult issue.
You know, what I say is that you don't think that you, Madeline Van Oken, can do all of the things that need to be done. But you need to find allies with the skills in the different fields. So you need science communications people. You need, you know, public consultation people. You need global policy people, and have a big meeting that includes the critics, and have those conversations, and have products that are seen to come out with legitimacy about representing all sides of the issue. That's what I would do. And it's daunting, but to drive forward with just the technologies is doomed. It won't work unless you're Monsanto. And then it won't work anyway. So.
Just to understand the state of the movement. So humans have been taking us for quite a while, and tools for genetic modifications are existing for many years. So is it something that is coming up now most only because of the easiness in which one can be useful for us, or are there other reasons why it's coming so strongly at these present times?
So it's a good question, and the people who have developed synthetic biology regard themselves as their early ancestors were the GMO, the genetically modified organism people. But that was very, they regarded as very crude. There were attempts to just pick up genes and drop them, and most of those failed. They didn't know where they would settle in the new genome. They didn't know what the epigenetic effects would be or the interactions within existing genes. And so it took a long time. Versus now, much of this is done digitally, where you're actually writing code and then sending it to have the DNA made, and it's modeled, so they have a much stronger idea. But it remains approximately the same thing. But that early stage of the technology created such a negative impact, particularly in Europe, related to particularly Monsanto, that it actually has colored the entire sort of public conversation. And the people who are against these technologies are drawing from the distaste that is felt by many people, particularly in Europe, about consuming GMOs and about property rights, which is what Monsanto did. So that's both. So to try to directly answer your question, it's the speed of change and the precision with which the changes can be made that is really changing the technology. But the earlier technology has already influenced the way societies view these changes. And those people don't think they should have to answer for the sins of their ancestors, but they do. They do.
Why do you consider yourself as a conservationist? As if yes, or are you conservative?
Yeah, no. So yes, and yeah, yes, and nature. And so that's a deliberately vague answer. Yeah, and
I mean, you must have a goal target, or like philosophical underpinning.
So my philosophical underpinning is to allow as much non-human mediated evolution to take place as possible.
Which you didn't talk about much.
Well, I had half an hour. I mean, you heard my entire life. My entire life has been about this.
That makes a lot of sense. So basically, you need this kind of, it's like having crutches. So is that the concept? So you offer nature crutches to survive our onslaughts or the curves to show us that under that shield still.
No, I think I'm trying to offer nature a skateboard. Yeah. Yeah, a skateboard, so it can do a certain amount of swerving in and out of more human-dominated systems. I just don't like the crutch notion. It's a very negative image. I'm trying to, no hope, right? I mean, on my crutches it says no hope. Yeah. So anyway, that's a big, I mean, this is the right question to answer. And for coral reefs, this is the right question. What is it we're trying to conserve? So if Madeline got her way entirely, what would result from that? And is that what we want as nature enthusiasts?
I mean,
Yeah,
the philosophical underpinning here is there's a separation between nature and humans, right? And that's a very Western view of looking at things, or like monotheistic, belief system where there's humans are somehow above nature, right? And so, I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, that's a reality we live in right now. Humans are nature in a lot of ways. Not in the sense that whatever we do is right because it's natural. I mean, that's not the way I see that argument. It's more what makes us think that we are in any way special. That is, I think, more the message.
So the answer to why in any way we're special is, come on, one more. Where is it? That's why we're special. There isn't any other species that would would produce those graphs.
Which result, the result of this is that we viewed ourselves as special and hence this was an acceptable, route of action. I mean, that's somewhat of a cheap and thing, but for example, in the malaria example, so you can do a gene drive to get, mosquitoes to become sterile, say, right? And so what happens to all those insects that feed on mosquitoes? Those are questions, I think, that are clearly answerable by saying, well, it saves human lives. It does and will. What's going to happen if you do? But that means that human lives are more important than insect lives. Those are things that I don't quite see as that obvious. I know many people do, but I don't find them that obvious.
Lots of mosquitoes have been introduced in Iris, but I didn't actually occur. So you can argue that they're introduced and it might be better.
So this conversation and the previous question to me is the world in which this is going to be decided with those kinds of different views. And we have to figure out how to pick our way through it and how to argue for what we want and how to listen carefully to other people.
Two more questions. Yeah, something that you mentioned and sort of concerns me, and maybe I'd like to have your thoughts on that, is that evidence, saying that you like to think that good solid evidence is the basis of decision making, and that can fold into policy and social change and so on. And yet to say, they've also said, though, that most people have an opinion that they've been reinforced by going to particular websites and reading such books or acting with others who have similar beliefs, but that it's really hard to change them. And to me, one of the things is that what is the approach to making new stories, new narratives, given these problems? Well, we're not really sure we want facts, and I already know what I believe. So how do you start to nudge people to open their minds a little bit?
So it's a good question, and it's a field of active investigation. Now, I referred yesterday to a book which I can't help keep recommending except for its price. It's called The Science of Science Communication. It's got 40-some short chapters surveying the recent literature that's been done. The editors of this volume start off by saying, the problem is that scientists think they know how to communicate, and they think that what they say is going to be regarded in a dispassionate way and received as evidence, and that's not true.
Well, I know that. I've read some of that.
Okay, so
we have to learn how to communicate in different.
Right. So if I had my way, I would own Pixar, the movie studios, which just released Coco, did Toy Story and what have you, and I would have them produce a film about synthetic biology and conservation. That's what I would start with, because I think storytelling is an essential part of communicating that we don't understand. And it's a fabulous book I read called Humans as Storytellers. And he starts out by saying, if you want to get the attention of an audience, so all you young people, and it's they're busy talking on their phone, drinking coffee, chit-chatting, say, once upon a time. Everybody stops because they want to know what happened once upon a time. Now, my experience is the next best thing is I'd like to tell you a joke, which also tends to get people to stop, because a joke really is a different kind of story. We don't feel ourselves, we feel it's unprofessional to actually engage in storytelling, and yet that's how I answer your question, because I think you. Yeah. So it isn't used a lot. So I mean, is that an interesting story? No. I mean, no. God, I hate to put a slide like that up.
But also something that's been signaled recently has been that we're losing biodiversity, we're fishing out the oceans, everything's going to hell in a handbasket. And the reaction that people have with so much negative information is that, well, I can't do anything as an individual.
That's right.
I'm just going to turn the whole thing off and that's it.
That's exactly right.
And there's been some op-eds in Nature this year about trying to give some optimism and some solution orientation rather than just it's all horrible.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And you know, my comparison has been, for those of you who remember such things, maybe we still exist, but in the 1960s and 1970s, American tourists were infamous for going to a country where they didn't speak the language, which is most everywhere, and you know, going to a restaurant and ordering a coffee, and the waiter says, "Como?" They say, "Coffee!" You know, as if by saying it louder, you were going to communicate better, and yet that's what the conservation community is doing. Sixth extinction! And society's response is, as you say, to go, I'm going shopping, or I'm going to go play Candy Crush on my phone, or whatever it is. There's some nervous titters over there in the audience. Wonder what you were doing during my talk. So you're right. Yeah.
Yeah.